Yes, we're now being recorded, which means that after the meeting, if there are any points that you've missed or you want to catch up on, the webinar will be published on the Thrings website, and you'll also be able to catch up on any other webinars that we've done at the time as well. So that will be a live resource for you all, our clients to use. So as I say, we're now being recorded, which is good. I'd just like to first introduce myself. My name is Chris Elias. I'm a relationship director with Thrings. I'd like to point out first of all that I'm not a lawyer, so no tricky legal questions for me. But I do come from a banking background, and whilst there probably won't be any banking or finance related topics which come up this afternoon, if there are, I'd be more than happy to jump in and try and answer those as best I can from a financial perspective. Today's webinar is another in the series of the Business Health Matters program that Thrings are running. It's a program that was started as a result of some feedback from our clients during the pandemic, where they were raising a number of common issues which had common threads. So we thought the ideal way to deal with these would be to present a series of webinars that we could address each of these topics in due course, and help our clients along the way. There are more webinars to follow. Our next is due on the 9th of October. We haven't got a working title for that one as yet, so we'll be giving some thought to that. And if any of you out there would have any topics that you'd like to be covered, perhaps you could suggest them to us, and we'll endeavour to do that as best we can. Today's webinar will be focusing on employment-related issues, as you've probably seen from the invite, and really three main themes, I guess. Really, we'll be looking at the job retention scheme, we'll be looking at new ways of working, and we'll also be looking at the risks post-COVID. So, in terms of what the brave new world might have in store for us when we're out of this issue. We have two panel members joining us today, and I'll introduce them now. So firstly, we have Natalie Ward. So big wave from you, Natalie, please. Big wave. There we are. That's good. So Natalie specialises in contentious and non-contentious legal matters relating to employment. Her areas of expertise include employment tribunal litigation, management of capability and ill health issues, redundancy, disciplinary and grievance procedure. So full gambit there. As you may have noticed from the invite, if this was a relay, we would be getting our money's worth out of Natalie today. She'd be our lead-off runner, and she's also been coming home with the anchor leg as well. So we've got two bouts of Natalie today. So good to have you with us, Natalie. Look forward to your sections. Secondly, we have Kerrie Hunt. Thumbs up for you, Kerrie.
Afternoon all.
Good, well done. Thank you, Kerrie. Now, Kerrie is the head of employment and the immigration teams at Thrings. So we've got big guns out this afternoon. We've gone to the top, which is good. Kerrie works closely with a range of corporates, from family businesses, regional businesses, nationals, global multinationals, etc. And she's extensive experience in employee relations issues, regulatory regimes relating to discrimination, parental leave, flexible working time directives, etc. So again, whole range of topics that we can cover there. So good to have you with us this afternoon as well, Kerrie. This will be an interactive webinar. So if at any time you feel that there are any points that you would like to raise or any questions that you'd like to raise, you have a Q&A question box at the bottom of your page. So please, by all means, type in furiously, and what we will endeavour to do is at the end of the webinar, we'll mop up and we'll try and cover as many of those questions as we possibly can. If we can't for any reason, we will endeavour to sort of publish the responses as part of our website, and so hopefully we will cover every query that people might have. Throughout the webinar, we will also be running a series of polls, and that will just help us get some first-hand experience of the issues that you've been facing and how you've dealt with them through the last 6-8 months or so. So that'll be very good intel for us in terms of what's really happening, what's live, what are the issues affecting a client at the present time. So that'll be really useful. So if you can fill in those polls, that'll be great, and we'll sort of cover those at the section ends. In terms of timing, I fully appreciate that everybody's time is of the essence. Whilst this webinar is down for an hour, what we plan to do is run the main presentation section for about 30 minutes or so. Q&As for about 15 minutes or so after that. So really, we would look to be all mopped up by 4:45, something like that. So you won't miss Pointless this evening. So you'll be finished well before then, I would imagine. So without further ado, Kerrie, Natalie, I'd like to invite you into the mastermind chair now. So I guess. But a job retention scheme, where are we?
Well, I think it's probably fair to say that businesses are going to be fairly familiar with the scheme. And at the moment, we're really winding down towards the end of the scheme, which is due to close on the 31st of October. And I mean, it's been a fairly dynamic scheme, and the most recent changes to it were that at the beginning of July, most people will know, it went from a completely no-work scheme to one where employees could work flexibly and be on furlough. So their employer could still claim under the scheme for the hours that they didn't work, but they were able to work some hours. So that really benefited businesses and allowed them to scale back up as the work required. Some of the more recent changes are that there has been a change in the level of subsidy by the government. So from the 1st of August, employers were required to pay the NI and the pension contributions. And as of the 1st of September, the government reduced what it would pay to the employers from 80% of the employees' pay to 70%, with employers picking up the 10% difference. And the last change will come into play on the 1st of October, when the government will reduce its contribution yet further to 60%. So employers will need to make up the 20% difference. So that's really where we are at the moment. We don't envisage any other changes now until the scheme is closed at the end of October.
So if it does close, and I'm assuming it will, if you compare it to what's happened from the finance side of things, the CBILS loan is due to finish at the 30th of September, and we've heard nothing to say that's going to be extended. So if we assume it is going to close, what other is the government offering any other sort of incentives, or any other sort of partial schemes that are likely to follow on?
Well, what it has announced is that it'll offer a job retention bonus. So that's going to be a one-off bonus of £1,000 paid for every UK employee who has been furloughed, who is subsequently kept on until at least the end of January 2021. So there are certain eligibility criteria attached to that. So the employees have to have been furloughed at some point, and there has to have been an eligible claim made for them. They have to have been continuously employed by that employer from the date of the most recent claim until the end of January, and they have to have earned an average amount of £520 per calendar month between November, December of this year and January of 2021. So they don't have to have earned £520 in each of those months, but as an overall average per month, that's the minimum amount they need to have earned to be eligible for this bonus. And they must not be under notice of termination of employment in order to get that bonus, which obviously goes to the employer. The government's also offering an apprenticeship bonus. So that's a bonus for every new apprentice that's taken on between August and January 21. And that'll be £2,000 if apprentices under the age of 25 are taken on, or £1,500 for every apprentice over the age of 25. And that's actually in addition to the £1,000 that the government currently pays employers for taking on apprentices between the ages of 16 to 18. So there's a couple of ongoing incentives. But other than that, as far as we know, the scheme will close. But most people will have seen the news and read the headlines and things like that, and know that there is a call out there for the government to consider extending it in some form. There have been suggestions that perhaps focusing it on a sort of targeted extension. Excuse me, just a minute. and perhaps focusing it on some of the sectors that have been hardest hit, such as hospitality and leisure, and the arts. Or potentially extending the scheme, but with a lesser subsidy, so perhaps tapering off as it has done in recent months. But other than that, as far as we know, unless there's a massive U-turn by the government, which seems quite unlikely, that will be it at the end of October.
Okay, so I suppose the other thing that you think about, really, it's been a hugely expensive scheme, isn't it, in terms of what the government has had to pay out as far as this is concerned. You know, you hear talk about possible fraud, employees being brought into work when they shouldn't have. Is there anything that the government can do about that, or do you think they've got anything up their sleeve?
Yeah, well, yes, they certainly have, and yes, it's been a massively expensive scheme. They say that by the end of it, nearly 10 million jobs will have been furloughed. 1.2 million employers have taken advantage of the scheme, and it's probably going to cost in the region of £35 billion. So yes, a massive expense for the government, and a scheme that sadly probably will have been open to abuse. It was not means tested, and there was no obligation at the outset to show that you needed to rely on it. So you didn't need to show that you would otherwise have made redundancies. So yeah, it probably has been open to abuse. And the other thing is, how is HMRC going to know whether employees have actually been working on the side while furloughed, when there was a no work policy attached to the scheme? There have been lots of reports of misuse. According to one study, I think there were about 6,000 reports of abuse or misuse up to the 22nd of July. And apparently a poll by a firm of solicitors has found that a third of employees were asked by their bosses to work while they were furloughed, so thereby committing what's become known as furlough fraud. And even if there haven't been unscrupulous employers, some will have just made mistakes. It's a complicated scheme, and applying for the reimbursement has not been particularly straightforward, certainly at the outset when there were several issues that were unclear. So there's a chance that mistakes will have been made. And the government has always made clear that it will audit the process, but we don't really know very much about how it's going to go about it. But there are some high-risk cases that have been identified, and the chief executive of HMRC told the Public Accounts Committee recently that they think perhaps 5 to 10% of furlough money could have been wrongly given. So that will certainly be a starting point for their investigations. And they'll probably look at those confidential reports and investigate those employers first. HMRC has actually set up a sort of dedicated fraud reporting site, which has a special section for furlough fraud. And apparently they've had about 8,000 calls so far. So no doubt they will start with those ones at the top of their list. And then it might be a case of random audits over the next few months and years. And that, of course, is going to be down to the resources of HMRC. And perhaps they may well consider, once tax returns are submitted, whether there has been sort of exponential, unexpected growth in the financial health of companies, which may lend itself to suspicion that employees have been working when they should have been furloughed. So that's how we sort of anticipate HMRC or the government will look into it. But the government seems to be encouraging employers to sort of check the accuracy of their claims in the immediate weeks, and to contact HMRC if they think they've been overpaid or indeed underpaid. And there is now some guidance on gov.uk for doing that. And it seems that if you sort of identify any mistakes now, there won't be any sort of penalty. But they will be the first ones to be looked at. And if there is any subsequent claim of wrongdoing, then no doubt there'll be some quite tough action and some penalties. So yes, that's what we understand so far.
It's going to be interesting, isn't it? In terms of if they do sort of follow up with a sort of an aggressive audit policy, where the resources are going to come from, I guess, really, in terms of their ability to do that. But yeah, we shall wait and see. Anyway, now is the time where we get a little bit of interaction. So I've got one further sort of point to raise with Natalie. Before I do that, I'm just going to run a poll, ladies and gentlemen. So as I launch this, if you could perhaps respond as Natalie's covering her final point, that would be marvellous. So there we are. That's the poll being launched about the furlough scheme. So if you are able to reply to that, that would be smashing. Brilliant. Okay then. So I guess in summary, job retention scheme, thumbs up or thumbs down? What's your call?
Well, I mean, the government certainly thinks it's a thumbs up.
Thumbs up.
But frankly, when you look at the headlines and hear about the redundancies, and obviously within our advice to our clients, there are lots of redundancies proposed out there. The Insolvency Service has warned of about 450,000 redundancies over the coming months, based on HR1 notifications. That suggests that there could be over 700,000. We've also heard warnings that there could be twice as many redundancies as we've seen in the previous recession. So, I don't know, doesn't sound like a particular success story to me. It sounds a bit like the can has been kicked down the road in terms of it's been great that people have been kept in work for longer, but actually it doesn't seem to have removed the real economic necessity that employers are feeling to reduce and restructure. So, yeah, time will tell, but it has been a huge cost to the economy, and yet it looks fairly certain we're going to be looking at lots and lots of redundancies.
Yeah, it's interesting actually, isn't it? Because even if the money hadn't been paid out by the government on the furlough scheme, they'd probably be having to pick up the cost in terms of social security and benefit payments somewhere down the line as well, wouldn't they? So there's an argument either way, isn't there? But anyway, okay, let's end the poll now. All right, let's just let's share those results, which hopefully everybody can see. So, in terms of are you furloughing staff under the coronavirus job retention scheme? I suppose the majority, 63% there. Some or all are flexi furloughed. So by far the highest. And 25% no, all back at work. So if you look at that, what's that? That's 88% are either flexi or back at work. So that's quite encouraging, isn't it? In terms of looking at that. And then, did you reduce your reliance on the scheme after the 1st of July? And look at that. That's 50-50 there. So straight down the middle. So some have, some are still using it. So interesting. Any thoughts on any of those guys? No.
No, I think that would. I think those sorts of figures seem to mirror what we're hearing from clients. They are wanting to get back up to speed, and there has been increased demand. And so yes, they have been for quite a few months now been endeavouring to bring people back. So yes, it doesn't surprise me that there has been that reliance on flexi furlough. In particular,
yeah. Well, as I say, it was a development of the scheme as it went along, wasn't it? So it seems as if it's working. So that's good. Great. Okay. Well, I'll just close those results down there, and finally, I'll just move. We can now move on. Kerrie, it's your turn into the hot seat. You can take a rest for a minute, Natalie. So, I suppose, Kerrie, we are looking now at the shift that we've seen, I guess, really to home working. So how will this way of working sort of change the sort of the office environment, really? What are the pros and cons as you see it for the new home working sort of regime that everybody seems to be experiencing at the minute?
Thanks, Chris. Obviously, I think the first thing really is home working is going to mean we're looking at our physical spaces, isn't it? So, if you've got, whether it's lots of small regional offices or you've got big open plan offices, if there is going to be the shift that everyone is foreseeing towards home working, then clearly we're going to have an opportunity to sort of flex or change those physical spaces. a very tiny anecdotally, I think I've got one client I know already who are looking at a lot of small regional offices or national offices up and down the land, and they're looking to close all of them, either to move largely to home working or to serviced offices. So clearly the physical places in which we work might change, and you might just not necessarily be downsizing or moving office, but just looking at the way you use that space. And there won't be sort of, you know, fixed little fiefdoms in different corners, but maybe you'll have a more flexible working space. I think there are sort of obvious impacts of that, fewer people in the office or people in the office at different times. I mean, on the one hand, a lot of people might go, hooray, less meetings. On the other hand, I think there's quite a lot of people who feel that it cuts down on all those little social interactions in the office that actually do an awful lot for team building and relationship building. So just that sense of knowing who your colleagues are, and the little sort of, not necessarily chats by the water cooler, but, you know, just those moments that you do actually get to know people better face to face. So that's a bit of a downside, I think, for some people. That when you suddenly have a bright idea and want to go and talk to a colleague about it, you've got to make that much more effort when you're sort of working remotely. I think the more interesting aspect, though, the sort of physical change is a fairly obvious one, but I think the more interesting question is probably around other types of flexibility, and one of which I think is flexibility around working hours. The current situation, as well as sort of sending vast swathes of the workforce home and lots of people setting up their home offices and working from home, also seems to have had quite an impact on how they and when they work. Partly because of pressures at the moment, the whole pandemic situation, people were homeschooling, juggling with childcare, maybe stopping the entire family to do the Joe Wicks PT in the morning, whatever it was. I think there was necessarily a lot more flexibility on when employees could do their work, forced upon them. And anecdotally, talking to some of our clients, could see that, accepted that, and were content that, well, thank you for working so hard and trying to work with all of those distractions, and that sort of flexibility built in. Now the key question is, will that flexibility remain? For example, people who might want to work from home, could they break to do the school run, come back to work? Could they pause to go off and do a lunchtime gym session or whatever it might be? Might the kind of 9 to 5 mentality, you must be at your desk at 9 and you must not move until 5 or later, and if I don't see your jacket on the back of the chair, could there be a shift on that? It's not any kind of great empirical exercise, but I have heard of one case where an employer is looking at saying, well, okay, the hours within which you can do your work are 7 a.m. till 10 in the evening. So play to people's strengths. If they're early birds, they can get on with it. If they're night owls, that they can get on with it. Obviously, it will differ from business to business, sector to sector. Of course, there'll always be key requirements where there's a sort of a core critical mass during certain hours of the day. But I do think it'll be interesting to see whether the type of flexibility and willingness to be flexible will translate into a longer term.
Yeah, good stuff. So in terms of what does it mean, I guess, really, from a management or a HR point of view, how will it be managed moving forward, do you think?
It's I think it's very interesting. I think the way that I would sum it up is a shift to trust from control. I mean, in employment lawyer lexicon, people used to talk about the master-servant relationship. And if you've ever had any issues over, is this an employee or a worker or a self-employed contractor, you'll have heard the word control used a lot. All of that is just around accepting that there's a sort of, day-to-day direction and instruction of employees by employers. But equally, you'll also have heard in employment lexicon a lot around trust and confidence. There's a trust and confidence necessary to the employment relationship. And I think that the word trust is sort of easily bandied about, but I think that having a remote workforce, leaving people to work at home, calls for a real framework of trust in the relationship, not a sort of parent-child approach to management and HR, or a master-servant approach to management and HR, but a real sort of adult-to-adult peer approach to HR and management. Because people have had a lot more autonomy, and people have perhaps enjoyed that autonomy to get on with their job. They know what they're doing, but equally that carries with it more accountability. So it could be a win-win for employer and employee, really. There has been an awful lot, certainly I've heard from clients, of stepping up in this situation, particularly at the outset when everybody was just doing their very best to adapt to this new way of working and get the job done, cooperate with each other, be more flexible. And it would be a shame to sort of lose some of that if suddenly there was a switch back to a, no, everybody's got to be at their desk, and we're reading that maybe some employees have felt a bit of freedom from. So I think there could be huge benefits to a sort of a slightly grown-up approach to, and it's not saying it isn't there already, but that sort of trust in, if employees have the right framework and they know what they're doing, let them get on with the job. It probably needs more proactive management in some ways, but in a positive way. And employees can use the sorts of initiative, have a bit of the autonomy that they've perhaps enjoyed in being able to get on with their job at the moment. There was a CIPD survey fairly recently, and looking at what the pros and cons of home working were from the sort of employer and employee point of view, it was interesting that there were as many pros that appeared in the cons list, and sort of vice versa. But apart from getting around challenges like some jobs can't be done from home, or not very good workspaces at home, poor broadband, or we don't have the right kit and that sort of thing, some of the discussion around sort of mental well-being or isolation at home or reduced interaction, which did appear as challenges, by the same token equally appeared in the pros sort of list. Some employees actually obviously felt they had a better work-life balance. They'd actually felt they'd had greater collaboration, and that might be those early days that I was talking about, the sort of, you had to proactively reach out to other people and be in touch with them, and also a greater ability to focus and fewer distractions. So I think there's that sense of people, if they know what they've got to do and they've got good parameters, clear expectations, they'd actually like to be able to get on with the job and be trusted to do that. So it could be a real shift, I think, and a move forward in that kind of approach.
So if an employer does decide to open up their workplace, and they decide they want people to go in, are there any pitfalls that, in terms of, you know, who you ask to go in, or do you ask, or do you tell, or, you know, what are the issues there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's similar, but the reverse to the question everyone was asking us right at the beginning, when they were saying, if we're going to furlough people or send people home, who do we send home, and how do we choose them, and how do we select them? And now it is about, how do we bring them back to the office, and who do we bring back to the office? And that probably will translate into a sort of future scape where it's not so much about bringing them back to the COVID secure office, although there are clearly, for the foreseeable future, those considerations, but it might be a more sort of longer term where you're happy to be an employee who has more flexible working, but you do still need some people in the office. And really, as it was at the beginning of this pandemic, transparency and fairness are absolutely key. You know, you need to be seen to be fair in how you're approaching these things. And again, that sort of sense of autonomy, I think there's a certain degree of people being able to sort of organise themselves. So teams, if they know what the balance is of people who need to be in and out of the office, then can they organise themselves? Can they have a rota? Can it be fairly sort of split? Equally, you can't just treat everyone as a sort of homogenous whole, because there will be individual circumstances to take into place.
So really,
and again, like, as we were saying,
transparency, fairness, and trust seems to be a theme coming out of what you're saying there, Kerrie. I think really.
I think so. And just on that area, the one kind of, hard kind of point to note, we always have to throw in the odd sort of scary mention of risk, which is making sure that you don't discriminate against anyone. You're not choosing them to stay in or come out for the wrong reasons, like their age or their childcare or their disability. You're making reasonable adjustments for people. You're not forcing them to work if actually they're better suited to staying at home, that sort of scenario.
Okay, lovely. Thanks, Kerrie. So right then, I think it's time to run another poll. So I'm just going to launch another one for you. Very simple question this time, folks. So if you can, there we are. That's running at the present time. So I guess then, Kerrie, just to mop up then, really, remote working, short-term fix, or have we got it for years to come?
Well, it's a really fascinating question, isn't it? I mean, again, quick survey stat. Apparently before lockdown, in a fairly good survey by CIPD, something like 18% of employers said they occasionally had people working from home. 9% said they had people mostly working from home. And it's anticipated that might increase to something like 37 to 40% of people occasionally working from home, which means at least one day a week in the future, in the long term, and maybe about 22% completely working from home. So that's a pretty big shift. I think the most interesting thing for me is seeing how this has accelerated. It's a sort of a mass movement, isn't it? And if I look at, and if anybody out there has ever looked at flexible working requests in the past, because it's not as though there wasn't already this concept, it just looks so clunky, that statutory process to request flexible working. Employees had to jump through lots of hoops, and there were generally lots of objections. Now, often those objections in reality were probably pretty much a gut feel, I just don't think it will work from the employer's point of view. Maybe there was a suspicion that, people can't manage remotely, they can't supervise or be supervised, they can't work in teams. There were lots of, we just don't think it will work. It's going to be pretty difficult to run some of those arguments now, because frankly, some businesses have had their entire workforce working from home, or certainly large parts of them. So going forward, I mean, if you've got a flexible working request, your policy, you're probably dusting it off and having a look at it and saying to yourself, well, is this fit for purpose? Because rather than it being down to individual employees who are making a one-off request, they've got to have 6 months service, they can only make one request a year, it feels as though there might just be more of a shift to a flexible working as a possibility, as a default position. Not having to jump through the sort of statutory hoops, not having to point to the statutory reasons why we can refuse. So it does feel like there could be a real sea change, a real sort of acceleration in that direction of travel.
Well, interestingly, I'm just going to share the results of the second poll now, so you can see those coming through. Quite clearly there, 70% of those people who have responded feel that they're going to have it's going to be a hybrid work scenario, really, with an increased percentage of the workforce, partial working from at home and in the office at least for a day a week. So it's interesting. That's a big number, isn't it? 70% in terms of the hybrid response. So interesting. Anyway, thank you, Kerrie. Thank you for your thoughts and opinions there. That's been very, very useful, much appreciated. I would just remind everybody, if you do have a question to raise for any one of our panelists, please just do so. Fill in the Q&A section. I've got some previously asked questions, so I will follow up with those if we don't get any. But if you do, just please follow on. So, Natalie, you're now back in the hot seat again, and if we can sort of look at the world post-COVID, I guess, really. So, what do you think? What's going to be the fallout in terms of employment claims, etc.? Where are we going?
Well, frankly, I think the fallout is going to be lots of employment claims. I mean, recent history tells us that whenever there's recessions, there are mass redundancies, and there are lots of claims. And we're also we may also see the fallout from the retention scheme, a quickly put together scheme that was incredibly costly, incredibly accessible, but also very, very confusing in the initial stages, and required a lot of updating and a lot of guidance. And I think we may see some fallout from that. And I mean, the sorts of claims I anticipate we'll see are probably things like wage-related claims, and they might be unlawful deductions from wages or wrongful dismissal claims, where, for example, employers have not paid correct notice periods, have miscalculated furlough pay, notice pay, holiday pay. They were all the sorts of issues and queries we were getting from clients at the very outset of the scheme, when it wasn't clear at what rate you had to pay those things, at what rate you would pay pension contributions, and the rate of holiday pay if employees were on furlough. So I think although those things were subsequently clarified, and there may have been a good chance for any employers who had made mistakes to rectify those mistakes, certain things may still come out of the woodwork further down the line. I think the likelihood is, sorry, were you?
Oh, no, carry on.
No. I think the likelihood is we'll see a lot of unfair dismissal claims arising from redundancies. I think rather than being based on the substantive reason for dismissal being redundancy, I think it's likely to be on the procedural side. So when you have large-scale redundancies, you need to invoke the collective consultation process. That's a complicated process. There are lots of potential trip hazards for employers along the way. And so that can give rise to sort of procedural failings and therefore findings of unfair dismissal. So I think there's quite a lot of scope for those sorts of claims too.
Like the, we were mentioning about the HMRC ability to sort of conduct the audit process. Will the tribunals be able to cope if there is a sort of a huge influx of cases like this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a really good question, and I think inevitably not. I mean, I don't think it's overly pessimistic to say that, but I mean, the tribunals were really, really overstretched before COVID. We were waiting sometimes between 9 and 18 months for a hearing, and sometimes that was just a preliminary hearing. So they were massively overstretched across the country. What they'll be dealing with now is the fact that during the lockdown period and still now, many final hearings were postponed. So they're going to have to slot those into the diary, and they're being listed now, but some of them are not being listed for another year from now. And then if there's going to be a massive influx of claims over the next 6 months, then there's going to be all those to deal with as well. So I think it's going to be really, really difficult. They're massively overstretched. And despite all the adaptations they're trying to make in terms of sort of having remote hearings or partially remote hearings, I think it's just the timetable is going to be absolutely chock-a-block.
Well, it's going to be an interesting time ahead then, Natalie. So thanks very much for that. Thanks very much, Kerrie, as well. I think a couple of questions that have just come in. So if I can just, I'll put those to both of you, actually. In relation to remote working, I wonder how this will impact on the next generation, for example. I feel like I learned a lot just by being in the office environment, listening to phone calls, learning from mistakes of others, etc. Will their experience and skills be reduced? Will general social skills be lost? Very valid points there.
I think that is a really, really good point, and I think it's interesting because I certainly you've got to be really mindful of. I mean, Natalie mentioned apprentices earlier, and we've all heard that it's the younger generation that have been hit by this. I don't class myself in that younger generation anymore, sadly, and I think they are the people often keen to get back to offices for all of the tech skills and tech savvy that they have. Learning on the job, learning from colleagues is absolutely key. So any employer is going to really have to be mindful of that balance of enabling people to sort of learn amongst teams and from colleagues. And again, it's probably, you probably can do it as well remotely, but you need to be far more proactive about it. I think one of the keys I would say, the difference between everybody working from home and coping with this in a crisis and making it the long-term norm is going to be about changing some things for that long-term norm. So you would have to rethink training and mentoring and supervision, you know, if you were going to completely work remotely. And if not, then make sure that you've got a really solid hybrid so people have that exposure and that opportunity. But absolutely, I'm sure any of us would say that, of course, you learn from looking, listening and watching the people around you.
I would certainly agree with that. So I think that's you know, that is a major issue to sort of consider moving forward if we do move away to a greater degree of remote working. Well, there's another interesting point here. Another point on remote working: could cities revert back to towns and more rural villages become towns? So it's that.
That's really
travel,
well. Interestingly, I live in a city because I live in Bristol, and Natalie lives in a rural town because she moved out of Bristol to a small village. So, I mean, it's a good point, isn't it? Everyone's talking about the sort of the city centres are dying, but everyone's saying local high streets are blooming because people have been at home. I think that's a massive question. It's a town planner's question more than an employment lawyer's question, I think. And an interesting one.
Yeah, and a lot to do with IT provision as well in terms of super fast broadband and the like. You know, luckily I live in rural Gloucestershire, and thankfully we've had fibre optics into the village, so that means I can work from home. But if you haven't got that, it does make it very, very tricky, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm conscious of the time, so one final question that's come in. Thrings, have we had any COVID claims yet? Have we dealt with any?
No.
What? No.
I haven't. Natalie?
No, I haven't either. And I don't know how long it will be until we see some. Because actually the tribunals are taking so long to process claims that, it could be some time. But we do know that the Isle of Man has seen a case. We've just heard about it today, and they seem to be not suffering the backlog that the UK seems to be suffering in their employment tribunals. But it was quite an interesting case. Because it does show the sort of approach the tribunals are likely to take. They do have a different legal system, but you know, they tend to echo each other. But it was a claim brought by a lady who had been required to self-isolate, and she thought it was going to be for a period of 12 weeks. It ended up being for 2 weeks. But when she told her employer that she was ready to come back to work, she received no contact from her. They had assumed she'd resigned, or they tried to claim that she had resigned 2 weeks earlier. And she said, well, no, I haven't. And really, the employment tribunal disagreed with the employer and said that actually it was the employer who had terminated her employment by not contacting her when she said she was ready and able to come back to work. And actually the sort of fundamental point about this case was that it was whether, in self-isolating and informing her employer that she couldn't work, she had been in repudiatory breach. And was it reasonable to consider that as repudiatory conduct in the sort of prevailing circumstances of the time, which was March this year, when the whole pandemic was blowing up? And the tribunal found that no, it was not repudiatory conduct. She'd taken appropriate advice from her doctors and from the government and had followed it. And therefore her dismissal by the employer at the end of the month wasn't by virtue of her repudiatory conduct. It was of their own doing, and it wasn't fair in the circumstances. She hadn't been given warnings or notice or anything like that. So it gives us an indication of how tribunals will look at employees who have done the right thing according to the advice at the time, and should be reassuring for employees who are self-isolating that they ought to have a job to come back to at the end.
What if you're just like the worried well, for example, and when your employer asks you to go back and you say, well, actually, I don't, I think it's too dangerous. You know, I'm not ill myself, but I just think it might be too dangerous to go back to work. You know, what are the sort of fallbacks there, do you think?
I mean, I've actually had quite a few inquiries similar to that, to be honest. And really, the sort of main advice is a lot about communication. You really need to demonstrate to your employees that you have taken all appropriate measures to make the workplace as safe as you can. You need to understand their concerns, and there might need to be sensitive conversations to understand whether they are someone who might need to shield, have an underlying condition, that sort of thing. But if they are, as you say, the worried well, and they don't say that they've got any, you know, any of those sorts of underlying conditions, then you still want to try and cooperate, communicate, and get them back into the workplace by agreement. So it's largely demonstrating that it is a secure workplace to return to. And that means, of course, following all of that workplace guidance that the government have put out there. You know, there'll become a point maybe when the employee is behaving unreasonably, but equally that is not carte blanche to rush out and stop strong-arming people back into the workplace. I'm not trying to give that suggestion whatsoever. It's still a really delicate balance at the moment. And as we can see, the situation is still really quite volatile. And we might be seeing greater restrictions again soon. So who knows what the advice will be next week compared to this week. And frankly, that's pretty much how it's felt over the last 6 months sitting in my chair. Yeah,
indeed. We live in a fluid world at the minute, don't we, really? So, you know, who knows what's around the corner. So anyway, ladies and gentlemen, true to my word, it's just gone quarter to 5. We've had all our questions. I hope you've enjoyed the webinar this afternoon. I found it particularly informing. I have to say, and I don't employ anybody. So, but you know, it's very interesting topic. I'd like to thank our panelists, Natalie, Kerrie, once again for a very informative presentation this afternoon. Hope everybody's enjoyed it. And hopefully we'll see you again soon in our next Thrings webinar. But for the minute, have a very pleasant, sunny Thursday afternoon. I'm sure there'll be a couple of bottles of wine being opened this evening, so please do enjoy something cold. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye. Have a good evening.
Thanks, Chris. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.